Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Um, Let me begin the panel discussion about the challenges of blockchain going forward by inviting my fellow panelists to introduce themselves by way of where they see themselves in the blockchain ecosystem, what is their application domain of interest for blockchain adoption. And then from there, in a different round, I will invite people to start talking about the challenges they see. Okay, Mark, shall we?
Thank you. So good afternoon, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here in Dubai. My name is Mark Tavener. I work with a company called Bitfury. We are 8 years in the blockchain market. For the first 8 years of our life, we have been securing and processing transactions and payments on the blockchain, namely in Bitcoin, where we now process up to 11 to 15% of the world's transactions. And more recently, we've been building software solutions for governments and large organizations around the world. So we view ourselves as one of the foundational players in the blockchain market. I have the great fortune in my role of leading business development, of traveling all over the world, talking at events like this, engaging with organizations. And it's very rare that I have the opportunity to come to a city which has such a positive, dynamic, and driven approach to blockchain. So I'm very happy to be here and look forward to having a discussion with you and my panel this afternoon.
Ishmael?
Ishmael Malik, I'm the founder of Blockchain Lab. We've been around for about 6 years. We largely started on the Bitcoin stack, and now we're sort of quite active in the Ethereum stack. And as of late, we've launched an ICO division, specifically looking at tokenization, utility, and more recently to that, we would be looking at how do you underwrite the utility value of a token over a longer period of time. And we're now doing scoping studies for several major industrial organizations and smaller governments on how they put a token economics policy and framework in place.
Great, the utility of tokens. So we'll come back to that. Thanks. Max?
My name is Maxim Ismailov. I'm with a company called Winding Tree, which is a decentralized marketplace, B2B marketplace for the travel industry. And as you may or may not know, travel industry is highly, highly centralized. So that's something that we're trying to solve. We've been in the blockchain space. I've been in the blockchain space for about 3 years. And before that, or along with that, I'm an entrepreneur in the travel industry, so I've been working on all kinds of different projects in that space. And it is very exciting to be here. And we're here also to see some of our partners, some of the airlines that you guys have here, and those conversations are going amazingly well, so happy to be here.
Thank you.
So, hello everybody. Thank you, Vincent, for the introduction. So, my name is Paolo Tasca. I'm an economist as background, and I've been working on blockchains for the last 5-6 years. At the beginning, I was at the central bank, as I mentioned this morning. I set up a research team on blockchain and more largely on financial disintermediation. So we look also at the peer-to-peer lending, crowdfunding, and all these forms of banking beyond banks and money. And a couple of years ago, I basically founded the Center for Blockchain Technologies at the University College London. And now we are basically certainly the largest center, research center on blockchain technologies in Europe, and with more than 100 people associated to our centers, and certainly one of the largest in the world. We have expertise from from economists, from, of course, computer scientists. University College London count on the largest computer science department in the UK and one of the largest in Europe. We have experts in smart contract law and many other complementary fields. So happy to be here, share my experience.
Perfect. So I'm going to invite our panelists to do a very quick, half elevator pitch regarding the biggest challenge that you see for blockchain development these days. And so please make sure it's a bullet point and describe the category. And then that will be the launch point of our more detailed discussion later on. Yep. So should we still run through the gamut?
Absolutely. So I think from Bitfury's perspective, the single largest inhibitor of mass adoption is education. What's quite interesting, there are some really, really innovative, forward-looking and great companies here at this show. But if you walk around and ask each of them what blockchain is, there's a very high probability that you'll get many different answers. And furthermore, if you talk to potential consumers of blockchain technology, i.e. those audiences that many of us on the panel and many of perhaps you guys represent, there is a very low level of understanding about what the benefits of blockchain are, i.e. why would an organization really adopt, invest, and deploy a blockchain-based technology. And I think that challenge is preventing growth because it's very hard for senior ministers at governmental level or senior executives in a large corporation to make big decisions around large commitments of budget and time without having clarity about what the end benefits are going to be, what the return on investment is going to be. And so the education piece is something that we as an industry have to work harder at. I think we're still stuck in proof of concept in pilot mode, and there is a danger that we are being perceived as the blockchain industry as an industry that's populated with consultants who want to charge a lot of money to teach organizations to learn about blockchain. Whereas our view at Bitfury is that we should, as an industry, we should be supporting customers and engaging them in a way which allows them to learn about this technology firsthand, working directly on pilots, transferring knowledge, and helping to uncover what those returns on investments are going to be, specifically for each of those organizations, based on real-life use cases. So, sorry, slightly more than an elevator pitch.
Okay. Mark, since you mentioned education, that happens to be exactly the same response that Max provided before the panel. So I will, Ishmael, I will go directly to Max for now, and I'll come back to you. Max, you also believe that education is a very big challenge. So could you elaborate?
Organizations and executives that are looking very closely at the blockchain as a technology today, they understand fundamentally what kind of change it brings to the table. They see it from our perspective, again, from our conversations with, I apologize, from our conversations with high-level executives from all sorts of different companies, they just view it as yet another technology that they could just plug into their existing ecosystem and benefit from that somehow. And if their competitor doesn't do that, they think that they're going to win. And people have to understand that blockchain brings a fundamental tectonic shift. It's a change in the rules of the game that organizations have to adopt. They have to adopt their business models. They have to adopt their thinking. It's a whole brave new world, just like the internet, just like the change that the internet brought to us. Companies that didn't realize what kind of change is that, I don't think that they're around anymore. So education in that sense, and of course education of people who are, I agree, even here, we go to many different conferences, technology conferences, where we speak at, and when we say we're a blockchain company, they say, oh, you do payments, that's awesome. Well, of course, blockchain is so much more than just payments, right? Well, to us, it's the fundamental feature of the blockchain is the removal of intermediaries. And well, there's a saying that if you're paid to not understand that, you won't understand that, right? And of course, those big corporations that we talk to are afraid of changing the status quo, and that's a problem. So lack of education and this inertia, this resistance towards trying to wrap their head around this completely different idea.
Sounds like Max, you're saying that what I'm hearing is that apart from there's a matter of a mutual expectation of what blockchain can do. There's also a matter of position. How do blockchain companies position themselves, and how do potentially adopting companies position themselves in front of a blockchain? So Ishmael, do you what do you see as a challenge? Do you see this also as a educational issue?
So the biggest challenge is regulators and policymakers regulating at each step of this journey, right? So the journey goes from being a very sort of simple ledger of value and store of value in the tokens on some sort of consensus framework to being a complete internet of tokens with programmable features and complete interoperability. What you have is regulators are regulating at stage one. Let's have Bitcoin, let's start to look at this and regulate sort of around the edges, some of the exchanges. You get to phase two, and now they want to sort of regulate around ERC20. Is it a utility token? Is it a security token? But more importantly, you're moving towards this phase three, right? We have decentralized exchanges, we have atomic swaps, we have an entire new stack of interoperable tokens that can be completely swapped in and out of, and you can have an algorithm do that. So the idea that you're going to start to put these abstract layers of what's the security, what's this, what's that, and they're trying to mold it into this sort of existing frameworks which are outdated in themselves. And what we really are missing, that this will likely become Web3 and Internet of Tokens, and it will be equivalent to trying to regulate small, tiny sections of the internet. So this largely is also a fault of the industry, where we have a lot of tokens that say, my token will do this. Well, where does your token do this in the web, in the ecosystem of the Internet of Tokens? So these isolated tokens, almost like these isolated websites, or even worse, bulletin boards that you just access. They're not interoperable amongst each other. There's no atomic swaps. There's no access to a decentralized exchange mechanism. So the phase we're currently seeing is you're going to see a large amount of tokens which don't have much of an interoperable utility, and therefore have not got much of a future in the Internet of Tokens. And if regulators are regulating these redundant tokens now, the policies and regulations may actually stifle and inhibit growth. So that's where it's,
Yeah, I think you brought up some very good points there. The regulators, I'm speaking from China, and the audience and my fellow panelists probably are aware of what happened in China last September. And the regulators' motivation of doing this kind of taking this kind of dramatic measures usually come from two main categories. One is that is for consumer protection or investor protection. Two is to protect the incumbent interest of major banks, of investment agencies. Now, do you feel the tension here is mainly a matter of asymmetry of information, or misalignment of incentives, or a matter of education? I would invite Paulo to comment on that.
Let me first elaborate a bit on what have been said so far. I think that overall consider and what is missing is a lack of developed ecosystem. And an ecosystem is composed of educated people, trained people, developers. We mid-2016 we count around 5,000 blockchain developers. I think it was IBM that projecting 2018 we will have 100,000. I don't know. The statistics is growing, but it pale compared to the Java developers all around the world, which are count around 9 million. So there is a lot of work that need to be done. And an ecosystem is also composed of VCs or companies that educate startups to use these tokens in their crowdfunding campaign. It composed also of analysts. We lack of analysts of this type of new business model, of this type of new asset classes. And of course, we lack also, as your last point, of type of regulatory framework that allow to have a clear understanding of the landscape. For what is my experience in Europe, we have several national, local, and supranational financial market authorities. I think that once I count, but there are certainly more than 100. And very often they are not good in coordinating between each other. Very often we have a bunch of central banks, and they don't have the same position with respect to what is a cryptocurrency. These are fundamental, simple questions, but it's very difficult to answer. And if you don't have a clear understanding, a clear position of what is this fundamental concept, it's very difficult that you implement a solid relative framework, even for applications, blockchain application beyond cryptocurrency. So more than a lack of asymmetric information, I think then, going back to your question, is more basically a lack of education, as we say at the beginning. So we need to give us time to better understand what is going on in this space. And of course, during this transition period, regulators find themselves in a very difficult and challenging situations because on one side they cannot stifle innovations, but on the other side they need to protect depositors and households, and therefore we may record some schizophrenic overnight reactions from some regulators that seems not to be rooted in some fundamental reasons, and sometimes we had some first movers reactions, like the BIT license in New York a few years ago that went basically was really kind of a disaster. So in this phase, I would not recommend regulators to stay silent, but I would at least recommend regulators to think twice before to react.
Thank you, Paulo. Such are the challenges. Now, how do we face these challenges, and how do we get out of the bind, so to speak, when it comes to adoption, when it comes to regulatory framework, and when it comes to continual relevance so it's a matter of organizing the resources to promote a more effective adoption. There's a matter of reaching a community consensus or synergy in pushing in a similar direction. And there are a matter of other things. So what do you feel are the things that the ecosystem players can do to further facilitate the adoption and the proliferation of blockchain. Mark, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I do have some thoughts on that. But at the risk of not talking too negatively about the problems, I just want to look back a little, if that's okay, first.
Sure.
And talk about the energy that is an ecosystem or an industry that we can harness and build upon. So over the last 2 to 3 years, we've seen massive strides made in this market. If we go back as far as, say, 2013, the entire industry was valued at 145 million US dollars only. Fast forward to 2018, the entire industry was valued at 800 billion US dollars. So in 5 years or thereabouts, the industry has moved from 145 million to 800 billion US dollars. Just to put that in perspective, the internet took somewhere between 15 to 20 years to reach momentum and scale. Going back to more recent times, in 2017, with the ICO phenomenon, we saw an incredible 3 billion US dollars raised to support and fund new innovation and new startups. So in 1 year, underlying blockchain technology helped surpass the entire investment from an established industry called VC. That pace of change, that positive momentum, that movement, if you will, is something that we all need to try and harness. So it's about trying to find the balance, I think, between regulation and encouraging that momentum. What some of that positivity has done is redistribute wealth in a way that we've not seen before. So previously, say some very young kids out of college might have had an idea, but would have been lacking perhaps funding. They would have spent, unless they were very lucky, a good few months traipsing around all of the different potential funders, presenting their idea, hearing that they were naive, perhaps not quite right at the investment stage, and many, many reasons why they wouldn't receive funding. But now, with blockchain technologies, those same innovative individuals who have a motivation to try and create something and a burning desire to get their idea out to market can launch an ICO and have the potential to receive funding far more rapidly within perhaps 3 to 6 months, as opposed to 6 months to sometimes 18 months, and get down to the business of innovating, adding value, and helping create new economies. So rather than constantly talk about, I think, the challenges that we have as an industry or the things we've not done well, I'd just like to offer that other point of view. And finally, just to close out, one of the points which we're very proud of at Bitfury is the work that we've done with the Republic of Georgia, where because the ministers who drive certain aspects of the governing body have placed faith in blockchain, we've been able to roll out a land registry service to an entire country. Now, granted, it's a small country with only a population of 4.5 million inhabitants, but that's something that even 5 years ago, we would not have imagined would have been possible. So legislation, I think, is important. Regulation gives structure, but we need to strike the right balance between not stifling the innovation and creating frameworks which allow the rest of the world to catch up with what's happening from a technological perspective.
Thank you. Ishmael, I will invite you to comment. Since you mentioned earlier about the utilities of the token and limited, constrained by the various conditions, could you elaborate on that and share with us your view on the ICO success, quote unquote?
So essentially, you have two types of ICOs. One that is launching just to raise funds and sort out cryptocurrencies as a mechanism for funding it. The project has very little blockchain type utility inbuilt. It merely has sought to leverage the blockchain for its funding mechanism. So just to sort of quickly elaborate, you have the simplest funding mechanism. You create an ERC20 token, very simple smart contract. You invite people to invest into that smart contract. In return, they receive tokens. If those tokens are nothing merely just an exchange of value, that is largely just bypassing the securities legislation, and you've offered a security. Rightly so, regulators protect against that. Unwilling parties can be asked to put money in and very little out. The project can have very little scope. Something on the complete other side, if you take Ethereum, for example, the actual token itself acts as gas within the network. It acts as the mechanism to initiate smart contracts. It has a fundamental utility to be used within the network itself. It may attain a value of over and beyond what was paid for it. That's with the utility increasing. So you have two diametrically sort of opposite sides of the equation in ICOs themselves, and the phenomena has been wrapped up in one envelope, right, for this initial phase. So currently we're sort of, some would argue otherwise, but I would say we're sort of on a level playing field. You have sort of 50% attempting at utility and delivering utility, and you have 50% just raising funds. I think 2018, you're going to see a divergence, but where it becomes exciting is where these utility tokens start to talk to other utility tokens. So you can have the emergence of the entire software as a service layer, the entire stack, all being programmable, and you can pre-purchase a bulk of utilities, whether it's storage, whether it's streaming, Uber-like services, sharing economy services, any of these major corporations that are about to be disintermediated. You can have an entire programmable money stack or value stack from this utility tokens. So the growth in the utility tokens is where the real excitement lies, right? For anyone involved, you can now start to see an ecosystem that grows and starts to have a network effect of its own. So in 2018, you're going to start to see utility tokens combined in packages, so you can sort of have your air miles as a utility token, then you can catch an Uber ride from a decentralized Uber, and then you can use the charge point, maybe have a charge utility, renewable. So you can have a sort of an entire journey or a consumer lifestyle or a business, all pre-purchased tokens or have tokens, all within this utility stack. And that stack, we're evolving rapidly, but it's still in development. That stack hasn't evolved. So what you're going to start to see is this divergence. So any governments that have jumped the gun and not really thought out their forward planning for this new economy are going to at risk of stifling this economy. So in terms of China, I'm pretty positive. I think they're going to reverse the ban. I think they're going to start. They've opened up several centers I've been invited to where they're actually scoping out which tokens have a greater degree of utility. And it's probably more governments, the UAE, which hasn't really thought through its ICO policy, has spent more time on the blockchain. So certain regions haven't put enough of a, they haven't put, as it goes back, they haven't put enough of a holistic group together to see where the value is delivered and how this token economy is going to operate, to actually make a value judgment or any encouragement or policy frameworks, and therefore every reaction is a knee-jerk reaction as opposed to a well-thought-out reaction. So 2018 will see the rise of potentially some new economies. You could see Gibraltar become a real hot spot for utility tokens. I just came back from Macau. We're building a token economy in Macau. I think has lots of strategic advantages. You may see one of the Emirates come forward. So I think any government that sort of jumps forward, Estonia's been doing a lot of work. So you're going to start to see ecosystems emerge, and they in themselves will fuel a much larger ecosystem. So what's at stake is if it can be tokenized, it will be tokenized. And if it will be tokenized, it will become available in an internet of tokens. So the actual size of the market, 850 billion in terms of how much addressable token market there is still relatively small.
Yeah, both of you mentioned dollar numbers. Frankly, I'm a little bit skeptical. If you look at the dollar numbers, it's always about timing, right? So you may feel that the dollar numbers could be vindicated in the historical perspective years from now, decades from now. But I will point to the year 2000 for internet, before the internet bubble bursts. Now, if we compare that and then to the rise of Google, Facebook a decade later, of course, there's a difference in quality of the dollar, of the same dollars, right? So are we looking at dumb dollars? Are we looking at smart dollars these days? You mentioned China, and this is mostly a evaluation, the judgment call made by regulators in China. So their assessment apparently is that, yeah, ICO has there's a lot of dollars involved, but these are dumb dollars that are of no or very little economic value. What they want to see is economic value associated with ICO, with a model like that. So I will throw the question to Paulo, and then I'll get back to you, Mark.
Thank you. I think that it's all true what has been said so far, and I do share pretty much everything. But we need to think the following. During the last 20 years, the number of listed companies in the US stock market decreased to almost 0.5%. So I think in 97 was around 7,000, 8,000, and now it's around 3,000, 4,000. So less IPO. And now we have the waves of ICO, which has some characteristic of IPO. But which is good because, as I've been saying, is a good way to raise money, to foster innovations, to create jobs, to promote the adoptions of these new technologies. But what is basically the alarm bell of regulators like in China and many other jurisdictions is the fact that some of these campaigns are basically branding campaign and a way to cash out quickly without any fundamental solid business model backing them. And having said that, this type of new type of IPO, if you want, they lack of a fundamental type of mechanism which is embedded in the IPO market, which is the legitimacy and the scrutiny of the companies. So when you go to the market to raise your tokens, you just prepare a white paper that maybe only few people will read, but no one from outside will audit the value of your token. You can say, okay, my token is value $1. Why? What is the fundamental value? Who is saying that this $1 your token? What is the pricing? What is the value of the company? So it's very, very impossible because the company usually, it has been funding only a few months earlier, and you cannot have any scrutiny from an outside authority. So that's the risk that the regulators are concerned about. The risk that some of malevolent business entrepreneurs are overpricing their tokens, or even they don't even, in the worst case, even have a solid minimum value proposition, so a solid business model. So, and this is bad for the good people that are working in this space, because this is again a bad advertisement for the people that are trying to use these new tools to finance themselves. So I call for an alliance between the startups in order to have a kind of an international scrutiny group that can check the legitimacy of the startups. That could be a very self-regulatory type of interventions that would be very much welcome from the regulators all over the world.
That idea actually was circulated in China, even both before and after the September event. And now the question is there a reasonable way, is there an effective way to provide the scrutiny and to provide the overseeing layer? And who are to be the judges? And now another perspective that I'm personally partial to is that we can address this from the circulation side. So right now, the coins are just issued and then they're speculated upon. There's not a lot of real-world circulation in the application domain in various industries. Now, what if we can separate? If we have a larger platform that integrate a large portfolio of various coin offerings with the real-world application-specific circulations? Now, that would be a good indicator of how much economic value the coins are actually associated with. That could potentially address some of the concerns of the regulator and the economists. Now, I know, Mark, you have 1 minute to provide a quick comment on this, and I want to move on to Max to look at this from a different, from a related perspective.
Thank you. So I just wanted to, I agree with the point of view that because the numbers are vast, it doesn't mean that the quality of those companies and the quality of the innovation is sound, nor does it hold true that the investments, if you want to call them that, are sound investments. The point I want to make is that there is momentum, that there is a catalyst that is driving change. I entirely disagree with the corporate policy of attaching a blockchain sticker to anything just to try and gain PR coverage, or heaven forbid, to increase your share price. Now, that was something that I'm told allegedly happened a few days ago. But that's not something which I think is hard for the general market to see through. What I would like to do is just highlight the value that we see at Bitfury of these investment funds being available in just a couple of use cases. So there is a very large pharmaceutical company who wanted us to work with them because they have a challenge in collaborating with some of their competitors to solve a problem around IP that they wanted to co-develop with their competitors to try and find a cure for a particular type of cancer. The particular aspect of blockchain that they wanted to deploy was not available at this point in time. So we put a call out to any young innovators that we could find who would be willing to invest some time in trying to develop this new approach using blockchain technologies. And thankfully, a very small company with only 3 developers came forward and was willing to put some time into this development pro bono, free of charge, because they had just received funding through a successful ICO. If they had not received that funding, we probably would not have got access to that talent. And the other example I want to use is around the separation of tokenization from blockchain technologies. So it's not true that every blockchain technology has to have a token that has a market value. Not every application. If you take voting in governmental elections, it would be entirely inappropriate to base voting in governmental elections on a blockchain technology that was linked to a token that had a floating value, because the economical model of processing those votes would be open to interference to the market. So I think it's important that we separate out, when we talk about blockchain technologies, the distinct difference between tokens that have value and blockchain technologies that can achieve value or returns in other ways that are not linked to financial tokens.
So, but are you advocating for 2 different kinds of tokens, social token versus financial tokens, or probably just one of the value-added layers is not to be measured by token, period?
So the point I'm making is that not every token needs to have a market value. It's a token that can exist without a financial value, that could be shared by participants in a blockchain, but that doesn't need to have a monetary value associated to it.
You owe me 3.5 minutes, and I will price each minute at the value of a Bitcoin. So you owe me 3.5 Bitcoins. We'll settle offline.
Yeah,
Max.
I'll just piggyback on the ideas that we've discussed here. Yes, there is a hype. Yes, there is a bubble. Mark made a point that now we have so much resources that we can just throw towards innovation. Inevitably, unfortunately, that creates this ecosystem where there are many, many bad apples. And too many companies are coming forward, as you said, someone said on Twitter that, did we just have our Kodak moment, right, as the industry? Well, maybe we did, right? So it is a problem, but let me remind you that, first of all, those cycles, the crises, are natural and they're good. It's good to be, here. It's good to be here too, for different companies, for different reasons, but those cycles are natural and we will inevitably go through that thing. We did go through that with the internet, many other industries, and well, that's not something that's necessarily bad. That's So, and let me remind you also that the whole philosophy behind Bitcoin and blockchain in particular is not to delegate your power, whether that's money, whether that's decision-making power, to one organization. So as much as I would like to support the idea that we should have better due diligence of those companies, I disagree with the notion that we should have some central authority, some body that would decide that, hey, this startup is good, this idea is good, and they should receive funding, but this one is bad. This will inevitably create the conditions where this organization will be the gatekeeper. That is, it will be bribed, it will be tricked, it will be hacked, on multiple different layers. So, and we get again to this notion of we should have better education. As Mark said again, it's not hard to see what Kodak is doing or many other companies are doing, even here, right? So I see, phrases like we're the new generation of blockchain startups. Excuse me, how many generations of blockchain startups have we had? Come on, people, right? So it's not hard to see these things. And what I'm trying to say is that you, by yourself, if you want to invest your own money, if you want to support some project, well, you should be able to do the due diligence. I've spent the past 5 years in Silicon Valley, and by far the answer that I get sometimes from VCs, very frequently, is, oh, we don't lead, we only follow. And I'm afraid of the same situation in the blockchain space as well, where you cannot make your own decision. You don't have the education, you don't maybe have the resources, but you should be able to do that because, again, that's the philosophy behind Bitcoin and blockchain. So that's just something that I would like to add here.
Let me add something.
Very quick.
Just quickly on the...
Very quick. Two sentences.
Just, we're forgetting something. So
One.
when I want to get into an ICO, I'm getting in there because I'm swapping my token value that I got in either Bitcoin, Ethereum, because I'm looking at the utility of that and I'm thinking, okay, 0x has got a much better utility. I'm going to swap this token for that. I don't touch fiat. So 98% is never ever touching fiat. You're swapping one utility value for another utility value. So this abstracted investors throwing in lots of money, a lot of it is token wealth being swapped from one token to the other because you've predicted a better utility from the other token.
Okay.
And let me add something to Mark. So basically, I'm not calling for a centralized authority. I'm just calling for we are living in a peer-to-peer sharing economy, so I'm calling for a decentralized type of control that can be a score model that is distributed across the network. But the people that have the expertise should be involved in this process in order to reduce the asymmetry of information between the potential investors and the startups. So that's what I would like to see.
Thank you for the clarification. So thank you all for your valuable inputs. I want to close out this discussion by sharing a little anecdote that hopefully will keep this discussion open-ended, because we talk about the regulator, we talk about the startups. Now, we have not got the time to talk about the investment community. I'll just share an anecdote. Recently, I was talking to one of the well-known VCs in China, operating in China. He's American, but he's I was asking him, why do you invest in this kind of blockchain startups, and why do you not invest in companies who invest in blockchain-enabled company rather than blockchain companies? So basically what I mean is that you could have invested in companies who apply the logic of the opportunity created by a blockchain to recreate, to disrupt an existing industry, rather than just focus on, say, blockchain technology. And he asked me two questions. One, where are they? Two, the value added, how do I get their value added recognized by my peers? If not, then no story, because I'm not the way blockchain is today, my company, my fund is not going to be his last destination. So I have to, this is the classical beauty pageant dilemma. I not only have to value my own aesthetics, I have to concern myself with the aesthetics of others as well. Thank you very much.